Knock it off, roll the truck, roll the truck, knock it off, roll the truck.
This never should have happened. This photo was taken just moments before a P-63 collided with a B-17, killing everyone on board both aircraft. This was a terrible tragedy, and the investigation includes several shocking details that just get worse the further you dig into the story. And that's why I'm going to share with you the deadly truth about the Dallas Airshow disaster. I'm Hoover, and welcome to your Pilot Debrief. Our story begins on November 12, 2022 at the Dallas Executive Airport in Texas. A group of 5 bomber aircraft and 3 fighter aircraft were airborne and participating in the Wings Over Dallas Airshow. The P-63 is the red circle, and it's the number 3 aircraft in the fighter formation. The B-17 is the purple circle, and it's the lead bomber aircraft. They're both lining up to fly past the crowd, and about 10 seconds later, all the holes in the Swiss cheese model lined up, and everyone watched in horror as they collided and plummeted to the ground. I don't normally do any sort of personal introduction in my videos, but I think it's important this time because you need to know that I am not an air boss. I didn't fly for the Thunderbirds, and I've never performed in an air show. However, I am a retired F-15E fighter pilot and mission commander that was responsible for planning and deconflicting dozens of aircraft in large-scale exercises, and I was also an F-18D FAC-A responsible for controlling other aircraft conducting complex air-to-ground attacks near friendly personnel. That's why I'm going to debrief this event the same way that I would debrief any fighter pilot mission failure. But before I do that, it's important to take a second to honor the victims of this tragedy. Craig Hutain was 67 years old, and he was the pilot flying the P-63 aircraft. Craig started flying when he was 17 years old, and he had about 35,000 hours of flight time and over 100 different types of aircraft. Lynn Root was 66 years old, and he was the pilot in the left seat of the B-17. Lynn had over 28,000 hours of flight time with over 500 hours flying the B-17. Sitting in the right seat of the B-17 was Terry Barker, and he was 67 years old, and he had over 25,000 hours of flight time. The other 3 crew members on the B-17 were 87-year-old Dan Reagan, 64-year-old Kurt Rowe, and 53-year-old Kevin Michaels. None of these men deserved what happened in this tragedy. Collectively, there was over 85,000 hours of experience between these 2 aircraft, and that makes you wonder, how was it possible for something like this to even happen? And that brings us to the man controlling them on the radio that day. According to the FAA, the air boss is the individual who has the primary responsibility for airshow operations on the active taxiways, runways, and the surrounding airshow demonstration area. I think the biggest problem with this definition is that it doesn't say anything about the air boss being responsible for ensuring the safe separation of aircraft or the safety of the participants. All it says is that the air boss must give a safety briefing, which is something we're going to talk about later. It's important to understand that an air boss is not an FAA certificated position. The organization that oversees air boss qualifications is the International Council of Air Shows, also known as ICAS, and they just recently created an air boss recognition program in 2019. Their definition of air boss includes words like command and control presence, mastery of airshow regulations, and they say the air boss is responsible for ensuring the airshow will be conducted in a safe manner. Now, I'm not going to mention the name of the air boss for this event because I want the debrief to focus on the lessons learned rather than focus on who that person was. And I know that his name is public record, but that's just how I want to run this debrief. Now, that said, the air boss for this event had a valid letter of authorization, and he met all of the requirements to be the air boss for the Dallas Air Show. In fact, he's been an air boss for about 20 years. He first started on the radio when he was about 14 years old, and he was running sequences in air shows by the time he was 17. The reason he was able to do this was because his dad was an air boss, and that's how he got into the business. When it comes to the air boss's background, he had a private pilot license with about 1,800 hours of flight time, and he had worked as a certified tower operator at the Fort Worth Meacham Airport between 2008 and 2009, which was about 13 years prior to this tragedy. At the time of the event, he had already done 16 air shows that year and had worked at over 300 air shows throughout his career. However, being an air boss was something that he was doing on the side because his full-time job was working at an auto body collision center. I think the main reason he was hired as an air boss was because he started working the show about 7 years prior to the tragedy. And my gut tells me that this is one of those things where once you're in, it's easy for the air show organizers to just keep using the same boss every year without asking too many questions. To understand more about what an air boss does, the NTSB reached out to the organizations that host two of the biggest air shows that every pilot is familiar with. One of those organizations said they knew the air boss and were very familiar with his father's style, which they did not believe was appropriate, and they were concerned that the son's style would be similar since he learned from his dad, so they never sought him out. Specifically citing the father as an example, the executive said that performers would walk out of that brief not knowing what the plan was. That leads us right into the next part of our debrief. What was the plan to prevent these two aircraft from running into each other? The first question that every single person involved in this tragedy needed to be asked was, what was the plan? Anytime you have multiple aircraft operating in the same airspace, especially if they're not part of the same formation, you need to have a plan to keep them deconflicted. And if no one understood the plan to make that happen, then that's going to be a huge contributing factor. What you need to know is that there are four main ways to deconflict aircraft. You can deconflict them laterally by giving them separate holding locations and different show lines that they can fly down and they're never going to cross. In the Dallas Air Show, they had a 500-foot show line and a 1,000-foot show line. Those numbers reflect how far those lines are from the crowd. And this is something that I created that shows you the plan could have been very simple. Fighters hold south of the runway and you'll be on the 1,000-foot line all day. Bombers you'll hold to the north and you'll be on the 500-foot line. That way each formation can use all the altitudes they want and they don't have to worry about hitting each other. However, if you want everyone in the same holding pattern, then you can deconflict aircraft vertically, meaning you give everyone a specific altitude or an altitude block. In this example I made, I've got the bombers at 500 to 600 feet above the ground and the fighters are 800 feet and above. This keeps everyone separate in the holding pattern, and then we can introduce our next method of deconfliction, and that's timing. This gives the air boss the flexibility to tell the aircraft when to leave the holding pattern in any order that he wants them to, and that way the aircraft can use all altitudes once they're inside these red lines and they can climb back up to their holding altitude on the opposite side. Finally, there's visual deconfliction, and that's where you put all of these aircraft in the same piece of sky and you tell them, hey, just look outside and don't hit each other. Based on the interviews, it seems like everyone assumed that the plan was for the fighters to just stay above the bombers. But the problem with that is that if you don't assign everyone specific altitudes, then now you're forcing the fighter guys to always keep track of all of the bombers, or they have to rely on the air boss to do that for them. The other problem with using visual deconfliction is that it makes things more complicated for the wingman. Because as a wingman, instead of focusing on flying in formation and being in the right position, now I've got to look outside and try to keep track of 5 different bomber aircraft. When it comes to the plan, the air boss was asked if he assigns altitudes to aircraft to deconflict. He said traditionally those circumstances don't come up, so it is not something I would consider commonplace. He was also asked, why wouldn't you use altitude to separate aircraft? And he said there are different hard decks for different locations, and so you could get in a circumstance where you start assigning altitudes, you run out of altitudes because I have a ceiling, right? So altitude isn't always the best. To clarify, when he's talking about hard decks, he's talking about the FAA rules for how low an aircraft can fly in an air show based on their location with respect to the crowd. But the truth is that if you're running out of altitude because of bad weather, then that means you might need to start taking aircraft out of the show. That's how you manage risk, and we did this all the time in the Air Force. Every formation would have an assigned block of altitude, but you always had a backup plan based on the weather. And if there's not enough room, then you kick people out or you strictly limit their maneuvering. To make matters worse, in the air boss's first interview with the NTSB, he said he rarely assigns specific altitudes because I don't want pilots looking inside at altimeters, they should be looking outside. Besides, there is no minimum altitude for an air show. It's called a cross-check. Pilots don't fly around staring at their altimeters, and it's very easy for a flight lead to get the formation established in the appropriate block of altitude, and now the wingman can just focus on flying formation off the flight lead, or if you're in trail, you just stay level with the aircraft that's in front of you. It's not that hard for pilots that have over 20,000 hours of experience to maintain an altitude and still maneuver the aircraft. Probably the most frustrating thing about this entire plan, though, was when the air boss said, I rarely assign altitudes in an air show because it can degrade safety to assign altitudes, speeds, headings. Let me make it clear in case there's any confusion. You need a deconfliction plan anytime you have more than one aircraft operating in the same piece of airspace. In this case, at a bare minimum, you needed a plan to keep the fighters from hitting the bombers, and there are several ways to do that. Altitude separation is just one of your options, and it does not degrade safety. So the question I was wondering as I read all these interviews was, if the air boss didn't use altitude separation, and if he had everyone in the same holding pattern, then what was the plan? And the problem is the NTSB never asked him that specific question. They asked him a lot of questions about what happened, but the closest thing they got to asking him about a plan was when they asked him what was the intent. What was he expecting to get out of that part of the performance? He told them that basically it was going to be the fighters on top of the bombers, and the bombers were going to the 1,000-foot show line, and the fighters were going to fly down the outside edge of the runway and outrun the bombers. If we look at this image from about 50 seconds before the collision, in order for the fighters to get to the outside edge of the runway, they have to cross the 1,000-foot line that the bombers are using. When the air boss was asked how he intended to ensure separation as the fighters crossed the flight path of the bombers, in his first interview he said, "I can't. It's up to the pilots, the flight leads and the individual pilots. I don't put constraints on them." He's basically saying that the plan was, I'm going to tell you where to go and what to do, and it's up to you to figure it out. But to make matters worse, he would go on to say, they shouldn't have been there. We do it all the time. It's never a problem. The phrase, we do it all the time and it's never a problem, is a textbook example of normalization of deviance. This is when you start with a standard and you deviate from it and nothing goes wrong, so your deviation becomes the new normal and the cycle keeps repeating itself until there's a mishap. There was nothing wrong with what they were doing because they do it all the time. And if you think that everything you've heard so far was bad, just wait, because we haven't talked about the other aircraft that played a role in all of this. We haven't heard what happened on the radio, and things are going to get worse. First, let's take a look at the products. And when I say the term products, I'm referring to a term from my days as a fighter pilot that described the paperwork we would take with us out to the jet. The products are an easy way for pilots to compartmentalize components of the mission and then reference them when appropriate during the flight. Even if the deconfliction plan was overlooked, the air boss could have made a simple graphic like this one that I showed you earlier to explain the plan, and then you pass it out to everyone during the briefing. Unfortunately, this is the product that was handed out during the safety briefing. Now, don't get me wrong, this document has its purpose and it's helpful for general awareness regarding the show sequence, but it has nothing to do with deconfliction, and it provides me little to no value as a pilot, and I probably would have just thrown it away because there's nothing on here that I'm going to need to reference when I'm flying around. This brings us to the safety briefing on the morning of the air show. Every fighter pilot knows that a good briefing helps clarify any confusion about the plan, and the briefing can mean the difference between mission success and failure. According to a witness, there was a lot of time spent talking about how all of the aircraft were going to converge at 1,000 feet and fly over the crowd in a deconflicted formation to end the show. However, there really wasn't much focus on what the bombers and the fighters were doing before that, and there weren't any deconfliction details on the slides. To me, this sounds similar to what the other airshow organizers said about the briefings that the air boss's father would give, where performers would walk out of that brief not knowing what the plan was. This is why normalization of deviance is so dangerous. Think about all of the experience sitting in that room during the briefing and no one asked, hey, what's the plan with the fighters and the bombers after we get airborne? What show line do you want us on, and what's your plan for what we're going to do today? Instead, everyone probably just figured this is the way we always do it and nothing bad ever happens. They were all largely relying on the air boss to orchestrate things and keep them deconflicted, but the truth was that the air boss was relying on the pilots to deconflict themselves. As the briefing ended, they all walked out of the room completely unaware of the danger ahead of them. Do you see the yellow line on this image? That yellow line is the flight path of a PT-17 Stearman aircraft, and the yellow circle was his location about 50 seconds before the collision. There are several reasons why this is important, as you're about to find out. One of the popular activities at an airshow like this is the public can pay to take a short flight in some of these historic aircraft. These are called ride flights, and they sometimes take place at the beginning of the day before all of the big acts in the shows start to perform. When the Dallas Air Show was being planned, the chief aviation officer for the Commemorative Air Force said he was very insistent that he initially didn't want any ride flights taking place at all during the waivered airspace, do it before or do it after. However, he got pressure from a lot of high-up people, and one of them was the air boss. He kept getting more calls, and then he eventually acquiesced and said that they could do ride flights while the airspace was active as long as they take off and land when another act isn't flying. It turns out that 2 ride flights were taking place during this portion of the air show. The first flight was a T-34 that landed while the bombers were flying around and the fighters had just taken off, and that was about 6 or 7 minutes prior to the crash. The other flight was the PT-17 shown in yellow. You can see that aircraft in this photo because they were landing at the time the collision happened. When the air boss was asked if it was normal to have planes landing while aerial activities are going on overhead, he said, "It's not commonplace. Not all air bosses have the skill set to accommodate that request. It's normal for us." This might come across as harsh, but I thought his answer sounded very arrogant, and it highlights again the normalization of deviance. Other air bosses don't do this, but I have the skills to handle it, so it's normal for us. The problem is that it's just one more thing for him to deal with, and instead of keeping 100% of his focus on the fighters and the bombers, he's trying to deconflict things and make sure that this aircraft can land in the middle of the act when he's got the fighters and the bombers flying overhead. Now, that ride flight was not the reason that this tragedy happened, but you're about to hear in the audio how it's going to be a big contributing factor. The bombers took off first, and this image shows the flight path of the B-17, which is the lead bomber. As soon as they got airborne, they made a right-hand turn and came back around to make their entrance over the crowd perpendicular to the runway. They made another right-hand turn to curve back around and fly down the 1,000-foot line. This led to the first dog bone. The dog bone is just a term to describe the maneuver where an aircraft will turn away from the airfield in order to get enough spacing to turn back around and line up on the show line. After they did the first dog bone, they started a left-hand turn in a racetrack pattern waiting for the fighter aircraft to join up with them. The fighter formation is shown in green, and they do a similar takeoff with a right-hand climbing turn and eventually make their entrance over the crowd. They joined up with the bombers in the racetrack, and they're now above the bomber altitude. Once you have all 5 bombers and the 3 fighters in the racetrack, they're ready to start the show. Let's listen to the last part of the audio, and I'm going to let this play all the way through because I want you to hear the pacing of the radio calls, and then I'm going to explain what happened.
Fighters, you can walk your way up to the B-17. I'm going to break y'all out after this. You're going to end up breaking left, so you're going to follow the bombers to the right 90 out, and then you're going to roll back in left and be on the 500-foot line if y'all want to set up an echelon for a break so y'all can get in trail.
Okay, say again for the fighters, that was not clear.
Fighters, go echelon right. Go to echelon right.
Okay, fighters, echelon right.
Time, 19:20
Okay,
minutes,
B-24, if you can give me a
seconds.
couple of inches and close the gap, I'd appreciate it. B-17, let's keep the turn a little flat for me. And just a little bit. When you come back through, you're coming through on the 1,000-foot line.
Here's Roger.
American fighters should be in a right turn. You're going to follow the bombers out on a right 90 turn, and then I'm going to roll you back in front of them.
40 seconds.
Second, need to drop it down to the deck. Runway 31, clear to land.
Clear to land down to the deck, 5
There you go, B-17. Yep, gentle, flat, roll it around, 1,000-foot line.
foot line for Raiders.
Fighters, roll it back to the left. Lead, fighter lead, roll it back to the left, and y'all get in trail.
21 minutes,
Okay, fighters in trail.
seconds.
Yep, and gunfighter, look out your left side and find the B-17.
See the 17.
Yeah, there you go. Roll it back to the left. I want you to get in front of the bombers. I want you to come through on the outside edge of the runway.
Okay.
Time, 19:21 minutes, 20 seconds. Time,
Wind check now, wind
19:21
are
minutes,
estimated
20
330
seconds.
12 gust 18. Nice job, fighters. You're coming through first. That will work out. B-17 and all the bombers on the 1,000-foot line. B-17, you got the fighters in front of you off your left.
Time,
Nice job, fighters. Come out through.
21 minutes, 40
Fighters will be a big
seconds.
pull up and to the right. Knock it off, knock it off. Roll the truck. Roll the truck, roll the truck. Knock it off, roll the truck.
0.
Listen again to this next part.
Fighters, you can walk your way up to the B-17. I'm going to break y'all out after this. You're going to end up breaking left, so you're going to follow the bombers to the right 90 out, and then you're going to roll back in left and be on the 500-foot line if y'all want to set up an echelon for a break so y'all can get in trail.
Okay, say again for the fighters, that was not clear.
Say again for the fighters, that was not clear. Exactly. These guys are trying to manage their formation and fly the aircraft, and the air boss is trying to explain the plan to them in less than 10 seconds. And also, if you didn't notice, the air boss told the fighters to be on the 500-foot line, but that was never acknowledged because they didn't understand what he wanted them to do. He told the B-17 that they're going to be on the 1,000-foot line, and then he said, fighters, you're going to follow the bombers, and then I'm going to roll you back in front of them. The problem with this radio call is there's no opportunity for the fighters to respond because the air boss immediately started talking to the PT-17 that was doing the ride flight and trying to land. Now you see why that ride flight was such a big deal. It's taking up time on the radio that could have been used to clarify what was about to happen. And this is when the final holes in the Swiss cheese start to line up, 30 seconds before impact. Nice job, fighters. You're coming through first. That will work out. B-17 and bombers on the 1,000-foot line. The problem is it would have been almost impossible from the air boss's perspective on the airfield to tell if the fighters were out in front. He's just saying his plan out loud again. But if I'm the number 2 or number 3 fighter in the formation, it's starting to bias my thinking that we're going to be in front and there isn't going to be a problem. 15 seconds before impact. B-17, you got the fighters in front of you off your left? The truth was that only the lead P-51 was in front at this point. So again, number 2 and number 3 heard this and they probably assumed that all of the fighters are in front of the B-17. Now we can't really understand the B-17's response, but we know that if the B-17 had all 3 fighters in sight, then they would have maneuvered to avoid the P-63, and there was no indication they tried to do that. 10 seconds before impact. Nice job, fighters, come on through. That was the final radio call the P-63 needed to hear to confirm his bias that he was in front of the B-17. The air boss just told him, nice job, come on through. I think this explains why the P-63 never lowered his right wing to look for the B-17. Craig is focused on following the P-51 in front of him. And even though it might have been possible for Craig to see the B-17, because the 2 aircraft are on a collision course, the B-17 is going to appear motionless on his canopy and his peripheral vision never detected it. My guess is that Craig in the P-63 heard the instruction for the 500-foot line, or he heard the air boss say the outside edge of the runway, and he was just swinging that turn wider to get lined up where the air boss told him to, but unfortunately we'll never know. If you're going to micromanage all of the aircraft in the show, you have to give them time to process what you're telling them to do and respond. If they don't have a chance to talk, then you're just assuming that everyone understands everything that you're saying. There was no deconfliction plan, and the level of micromanagement from the air boss created a clear impression that he was providing a high level of control over the aircraft and would be the one responsible for ensuring their safe separation. However, the reality was the air boss was telling them what to do and then just hoping that the pilots wouldn't run into each other. The radio was way too busy, there were too many distractions with the pyrotechnics and the aircraft landing in the middle of the act, and there was just too much freeform going on in this show. And when the air boss was asked if there was anything he'd do differently if he had a chance to do it over again, he said, "I don't really know how to answer that right now." Unfortunately, to make matters worse, when he was asked if he had anything else to add, he said, "It's not fair to say that adding a restriction increases safety." I couldn't disagree more. You need to have a plan, and you need to have restrictions in place that are designed to keep aircraft from running into each other, while also allowing them and the air boss as much flexibility as possible during the air show. The deadly truth is that a lot of holes in the Swiss cheese model needed to line up for this tragedy to happen. But when you have a normalization of deviance, you start removing some of the slices of Swiss cheese. And that means there's going to be a greater chance that something's going to go wrong. Although this debrief focused a lot on the air boss, the truth is that over the years, there have been a lot of deadly airshow disasters that had nothing to do with the air boss and instead were the result of pilot mistakes. One of those disasters happened at Ramstein Air Base when a demonstration team collided in front of the crowd. And if you want to learn more about what happened and the 10 deadliest airshow disasters in history, then click on this video on the screen and I'll see you on the next debrief.